On an ordinary Tuesday morning, the schoolyard should have echoed with laughter and the shrill ring of the bell. Instead, it echoed with screams, blood, and the unthinkable. An attack on one of the most powerful women in the city. And the man who saved her was the one no one ever noticed. The schoolyard was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that lingers right before the storm of children rushing in with their backpacks and laughter. A sleek white car glided through the gates, drawing curious glances from a few parents and teachers standing nearby. Its polished surface reflected the pale light of the early sun, and when the door opened, a pair of heels clicked against the pavement with the kind of confidence that instantly commanded attention. Catherine Williams stepped out. 33 years old, already one of the youngest female CEOs in the state, she carried herself with a poise that made it impossible not to notice her. She wore a perfectly tailored white suit, sharp lines contrasting with the softness of her blonde hair that fell in smooth waves to her shoulders. Her brown eyes were alert, calculating, yet softened the moment they shifted to the little girl climbing out of the car behind her. The girl was Lily, her 8-year-old daughter, with a pink backpack that seemed almost too big for her small frame. She adjusted the straps with a practiced tug, and Catherine crouched down to smooth one of Lily's braids, her manicured hand looking almost fragile against the child's hair. For a moment, the hardened executive disappeared, and what remained was simply a mother, tired, overworked, but determined to give her daughter something resembling a normal childhood. Lily looked around the schoolyard, her eyes scanning for friends. Some children already pointed toward the expensive car, whispering, but Lily didn't notice. She clutched her mother's hand and gave her a wide, easy smile, the kind only a child untouched by the world's darkness could give. Catherine forced herself to smile back, though her thoughts were far away, back in her office, in the storm of meetings, lawsuits, and responsibilities that seemed to never end. She had almost canceled the drive this morning, almost sent the driver instead. But some instinct, some pull of guilt and love, made her come herself. As she walked Lily toward the steps, Catherine felt the shift in the air. Parents glanced at her the way people often did when they recognized her from magazines or television interviews. There was admiration, yes, but also envy, sometimes even disdain. She was too young, too successful, too composed. People couldn't decide whether to praise her or resent her. Catherine knew all of it, felt it like a weight on her back, but she ignored it. The only thing that mattered at that moment was the little hand still holding hers. The morning seemed ordinary, deceptively so. Birds sang above the brick buildings. The janitor pushed his broom across the asphalt with slow, practiced strokes, and the bell inside the school was minutes from ringing. To anyone else, it was just another day in a small American town. But Catherine, though she didn't know it yet, was standing on the thin edge of a moment that would shatter everything she believed safe. She kissed Lily on the forehead, crouching low again so their eyes met. "Be good today," she whispered softly. Lily nodded with an exaggerated seriousness that made Catherine laugh under her breath. For one fleeting second, the world felt gentle. Neither of them could have imagined how violently that illusion would be torn apart only moments later. The janitor moved slowly across the cracked asphalt of the schoolyard, the long wooden handle of the broom leaning against his shoulder as though it were an extension of his body. Every morning looked the same to him, faded chalk lines marking where children played ball, cigarette butts tossed near the far fence by careless teenagers after hours, damp leaves carried by the wind and scattered in corners. He had been cleaning this school for nearly a decade, and though the work was monotonous, there was a strange comfort in routine. His name was Jack Martin, 36 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of face that seemed carved by years of exhaustion and quiet responsibility. His features were strong, but his eyes carried a heaviness that never quite went away, the kind that only appeared in men who had lost more than they should have at a young age. The students barely noticed him most of the time. To them, he was just the janitor, an invisible part of the school, pushing a mop down endless hallways, fixing squeaky doors, sweeping the playground when no one else bothered. But Jack had another life, one few people saw. At home in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, a 14-year-old boy was waiting for him every night. His son, Noah, was the reason Jack got out of bed in the mornings, the reason he forced himself to keep moving, no matter how heavy his shoulders felt. 5 years earlier, Jack's wife had passed away after a sudden illness, leaving him with a child to raise and a mountain of grief that threatened to bury him. He had stumbled through those first years like a man drowning, taking whatever work he could find. When the school offered him a steady job with health benefits, he didn't think twice. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And it gave him enough to keep Noah clothed, fed, and in school. Jack often wondered if people understood how much effort it took to keep life stitched together when you were both mother and father. He worked late, cooked meals that weren't always good, helped with homework he barely remembered himself, and sometimes sat in the dark long after Noah had gone to bed, staring at old photographs of a life that would never return. He rarely talked about it. People didn't want to hear about pain. They wanted small talk, smiles, and the illusion that everything was fine. So Jack gave them that illusion, while inside he carried a loneliness that pressed down like an anvil. This morning, he swept the yard the way he always did, his movements steady and unhurried. The handle of the broom was worn smooth from years of use, fitting his calloused hands as naturally as a glove. He glanced up every so often at the children arriving, parents walking them in, cars pulling up and pulling away. He noticed details others ignored. The shy girl clutching her backpack, straps too tight, the teacher balancing a stack of papers on one arm while digging in her purse with the other, the nervous boy pretending to look at his shoes because he didn't want to say goodbye to his mom. Jack saw it all, quietly cataloging the small dramas of everyday life. And then, for just a moment, his gaze fell on the white car that had pulled into the schoolyard. He saw the tall woman step out, immaculate in her suit, the kind of person who looked like she belonged in a glass office building in the city, not in front of a brick school with peeling paint. Next to her was a little girl with bright eyes and a backpack nearly as big as her. Jack recognized the girl. He'd seen her before, but the mother rarely came herself. He guessed she was one of those high-powered executives he sometimes read about in the paper. People who lived in another world entirely. Jack leaned on his broom for a second, watching them. The contrast between them and him was stark, her polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his own worn work boots scuffed from years of labor. He didn't envy her, though. He had seen enough of life to know that every person, no matter how perfect they looked on the outside, carried some weight of their own. And besides, envy was a luxury. Jack had no time for it. He sighed, shifted his broom, and kept sweeping, unaware that within minutes his ordinary day would collapse into chaos, and that he, the man nobody noticed, would be the one forced to step forward when everyone else froze. The air seemed ordinary, almost peaceful when it happened. Children scattered across the yard, some running to the jungle gym, others standing in clusters, laughing and trading secrets before the bell rang. Parents were still pulling out of the drop-off lane, waving goodbye from car windows. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted faintly from the field. Nothing about the moment suggested danger, until it broke apart in an instant. Catherine had just let go of Lily's hand. Her daughter skipped ahead toward the front steps, the pink backpack bouncing with each step. Catherine lingered for only a second, adjusting the strap of her purse, when two figures emerged from the edge of the schoolyard. They moved fast, shadows cutting through the morning light, hoods pulled low over their faces. Their pace was too direct, too purposeful to be mistaken for passers-by. In the space of a heartbeat, they were upon her. The first man lunged, his hand clamping around Catherine's arm with a grip so tight it burned through the thin fabric of her white blazer. The second yanked the leather briefcase from her grasp, jerking her body forward with the motion. She gasped in shock, her heels scraping against the pavement as they tried to pull her toward the car she had just stepped out of. For a split second, her mind refused to accept what was happening. This couldn't be real, not here, not in front of children. But the pain in her wrist and the sudden terror in her chest made it real in an instant. "Mom!" Lily's scream cut through the noise of the yard. The children around her froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Some shrieked and ran toward the doors. Others stood motionless, eyes wide with fear. A teacher nearby dropped her papers, stunned into stillness. Catherine fought back, her free hand clawing at the man's arm, her voice rising into a sharp cry. She tried to twist away, but her heels slipped and she stumbled. The attackers didn't care about the scene they were making. They shoved and pulled with brute strength, determined to drag her back toward the waiting car. The briefcase, heavy with documents, thudded against the ground. But the man didn't stop. Jack Martin saw it all. From across the yard where his broom scraped idly against the pavement, his eyes caught the jerking motion of Catherine's body, the unnatural way she was being yanked. At first, his mind lagged behind his eyes. Attacks like this didn't happen here. Not in a quiet town, not in front of children. But when he saw the knife glint in one of the men's hands, just for a second as the hood shifted, his body reacted before thought could catch up. The noise spread like wildfire. Children screamed, parents in cars honked horns. Someone shouted to call the police, but the attackers didn't stop. One of them growled something under his breath. Words Catherine didn't fully catch, but that chilled her blood all the same. It wasn't just a mugging, the rage in his tone, the force in his grip. It was personal. Catherine's knees buckled as she tried to resist, her immaculate white suit brushing against the gritty pavement, staining instantly. She cried out again, struggling to stay upright, her eyes flashing desperately toward Lily, who stood frozen near the steps, tears streaking her face. For a mother, the greatest fear wasn't the pain in her own arm, but the sight of her child helpless, watching. In that suspended, chaotic moment, the world seemed to split. On one side was the life Catherine had always known, controlled, polished, built on power and discipline. On the other side was raw, unfiltered survival. And standing at the edge of that divide was Jack, the man with the broom, who knew nothing of boardrooms or luxury cars but understood one truth with brutal clarity. If he didn't move now, that little girl was going to watch her mother disappear. Forever. Jack didn't remember dropping the broom. One second it was in his hands. The next it was clattering to the ground as he broke into a run. His boots pounded against the asphalt, the sound lost beneath the screams and chaos unraveling across the schoolyard. The attackers were dragging Catherine backward, one hand clamped around her arm, the other fumbling to shove her toward the open car door. Her heels skidded against the ground, her voice raw from shouting. But the men were stronger, faster, relentless. Jack's body moved on instinct, fueled by something deeper than thought, something born of years of protecting a child, of knowing what it meant to stand between danger and someone who couldn't defend themselves. He closed the distance in seconds. His hand shot out, grabbing the handle of the fallen broom, and with a sharp, practiced twist, he swung it like a bat. The first blow landed squarely across the back of the nearest man. The crack of wood against bone echoed through the air, followed by the man's guttural grunt as he lurched forward, releasing Catherine's arm just enough for her to stumble free. Gasps rippled from the cluster of children and teachers, but Jack didn't stop. He pivoted, muscles coiling, and slammed the broomstick forward again. This time it connected with the second attacker's face. A sickening thud split the chaos as the man staggered backward, clutching his nose, blood already streaming between his fingers. His hood slipped back, revealing eyes wild with fury. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from a school janitor with a broom in his hands. For a heartbeat, both men froze, their shock almost visible in the way they hesitated. Catherine, panting, stumbled to the ground, her palms scraping against the rough pavement. She blinked up, dazed, hardly processing what she'd just seen. The man who had been sweeping leaves only moments ago now stood like a wall in front of her, his chest heaving, eyes locked on the attackers with a sharpness that made him look like someone else entirely. Jack adjusted his grip on the broom, the wood trembling slightly in his hands from the force of his strikes. He was no fighter. He'd never been in a ring, never trained for combat. But years of hard work had built strength in his arms, and years of fatherhood had taught him a fierceness that no training could replicate. In that moment, he wasn't just a janitor. He was a guardian, a man with nothing to lose and someone to protect. The attackers recovered quickly, their hesitation hardening into rage. One spat blood onto the ground, his words muffled by the hand pressed against his ruined nose. The other squared his shoulders, knife glinting now, fully in his grip. Their message was clear. They weren't done. Around them, the yard was in chaos. Teachers screamed for children to get inside. Parents fumbled for their phones. A car horn blared as someone tried to back away too quickly. Lily's voice cut through all of it. "Mom!" High-pitched, desperate, trembling. Catherine's heart clenched at the sound, and Jack's jaw tightened. He shifted his stance, planting himself firmly between Catherine and the men. His voice, low and steady, carried over the noise. "You'll have to go through me first." It was not a threat, not even a warning. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of conviction that only someone who had already made peace with risk could summon. He raised the broom like a spear, his eyes unflinching. The men glanced at each other, their confidence wavering for the briefest second. This was supposed to be quick, clean, 2 against 1. A woman dragged into a car, a silent getaway. They hadn't counted on interruption, certainly not by a man with nothing but a broom and the raw determination of someone who refused to step aside. For Catherine, still on the ground, watching through the blur of fear, it was a moment she would never forget. The polished world she came from, the offices, the board meetings, the endless calculations, had never shown her this kind of courage. It was shocking, almost absurd, and yet it was real. The janitor, the invisible man sweeping corners, had just done what no one else had dared. He had stood up, and the fight was only beginning. Catherine's chest burned as she forced herself upright, her palms scraped raw, her knees aching from the fall. Her white suit was ruined, streaked with dirt, but none of that mattered. The only thing she could see clearly was Lily, her daughter standing frozen near the steps, tears running down her cheeks, too paralyzed with fear to move. Catherine's instinct screamed at her to get up, to run to her child, to throw herself over her, but she couldn't, not with the 2 men still standing there, their focus now fixed on her. Jack remained in front of her like a shield, gripping the broomstick so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He didn't flinch when the taller of the 2 attackers wiped the blood from his face and spat onto the ground. The shorter one, the one holding the knife, sneered as he shifted his weight. His dark eyes locked on Catherine. "You think a janitor's gonna save you?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You were warned. You should have kept quiet." Catherine froze. The words sliced through the chaos louder than any scream, louder than the sirens that now faintly wailed in the distance. She understood them instantly. Her heart stuttered in her chest as the truth clawed its way to the surface. This was not random, not a mugging, not a freak act of violence. "They're here for me," she whispered, her voice hoarse, more to herself than to anyone else. Her head turned sharply toward Jack, eyes wide, filled with a desperation that bordered on panic. "This isn't about money. They want me." Jack didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the men, his jaw tightening at her words, but he gave no sign of fear. His voice was steady when he answered, low enough for only her to hear. "Then we don't let them take you." Catherine's breath came in shallow gasps. She thought of boardrooms filled with polished tables, lawyers arguing in sharp voices, the secret files her company had unearthed months ago. Documents that traced millions of dollars in laundered money to people with names that could never be spoken, allowed without consequence. She had made the choice to hand that evidence to federal investigators, knowing the risk, knowing it painted a target on her back. She had told herself she was ready for the fallout, but she had imagined courtrooms, subpoenas, maybe even a smear campaign in the press. She had never imagined this. Men dragging her in front of her child, violence erupting in a schoolyard. Her hands shook as she brushed hair from her face, her eyes darting to Lily again. The little girl's lips trembled as she called out, "Mom!" The sound cracked something inside Catherine. She had been willing to risk her career, her reputation, even her safety, but she had never meant to endanger her daughter. The shorter attacker, the one with the knife, stepped forward, his tone mocking. "They told us you were smart, but here you are, screaming in the dirt. Not so powerful now, are you?" Jack moved with him, shifting his stance, raising the broom in a quick, defensive arc. His breathing was ragged but steady. He wasn't a fighter, not trained for this, but Catherine could see the resolve in him, an unshakable will forged not from skill, but from necessity. He had the look of a man who had faced storms before, storms of a different kind, and knew what it meant to stand your ground when no one else would. The taller man wiped at his bloodied face again and growled, "Enough stalling. Grab her." Catherine's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to scream again, to plead, but her voice stuck in her throat. For the first time in years, the woman who had commanded boardrooms with flawless confidence felt powerless. The weight of everything she had tried to hide, the documents, the depositions, the dangerous names written in ink, crashed down on her shoulders. She had thought she could fight corruption from the safety of her office. She hadn't realized the fight would come here, to her daughter's schoolyard with knives and fists. Jack's body shifted slightly, placing himself even more firmly between her and the men. His back blocked her view, but she could see the tension rippling through him. It struck her then. He didn't owe her anything. He wasn't a bodyguard, wasn't a police officer, wasn't anyone paid to protect her. He was just a man with a broom, a single father working long hours to keep his son fed. And yet here he stood, refusing to move, choosing to make her fight his own. For the first time since the attack began, something inside Catherine flickered. Not hope, not yet, but the recognition that she was not alone. And in the attacker's eyes, for just a moment, she saw the same recognition. That the man they had dismissed as nothing, the invisible worker they hadn't even noticed sweeping leaves minutes before, was now the obstacle between them and their target. The air tightened like a bowstring pulled to its limit. The knife glinted in the sun. Catherine's heart beat so loudly she thought it might burst. The next move would decide everything. The knife caught the light as the shorter man lunged forward. For an instant, everything slowed. The screams of children blurred into a dull roar. The ringing of the school bell became a hollow echo. Catherine's breath froze in her chest as she saw the flash of steel aimed not at her, but at the man standing between her and danger. Jack twisted to meet the strike. The broom raised like a shield. The blade sliced downward, grazing past the wood and tearing into his shoulder. The shock of the impact sent fire through his body, and he staggered back, gritting his teeth. Warm blood began to seep through the fabric of his shirt, spreading quickly. But Jack refused to fall. He tightened his grip on the broken handle of the broom and shoved forward, slamming it into the attacker's chest with enough force to knock him back a step. Catherine let out a strangled cry, her instinct to move toward him, but she couldn't. Her legs felt like stone, her body locked in place by terror. She had never seen violence so close, never watched blood stain a man's shirt right in front of her. The woman who had once walked into courtrooms armed with evidence and confidence suddenly felt small, fragile, utterly unprepared. The taller attacker roared and rushed forward, his bloodied face twisted with rage. Jack spun, using the broom like a spear, jabbing it hard into the man's ribs. The sound that followed was raw and animal, a grunt that tore through clenched teeth. The man doubled over but didn't go down. He swung wildly, catching Jack's arm, sending another jolt of pain through his battered body. The knife wielder regained his footing, circling like a predator waiting for the right opening. His lips curled into a sneer as he saw Jack falter. "You should have stayed invisible, old man," he spat. Jack's chest heaved. His body screamed at him to stop, to give in, but his mind refused. He thought of Noah, his son, waiting at home, depending on him. He thought of Lily, crying out for her mother, her small frame trembling on the steps. He thought of Catherine, bruised and terrified, fighting to protect not only herself, but the truth she carried. In that moment, Jack understood what it meant to stand in the line of fire for something bigger than himself. He tightened his grip on the broom's splintered shaft. Blood dripped from his fingers, staining the wood, but his eyes burned with determination. When the man with the knife lunged again, Jack didn't back away. Instead, with every ounce of strength left in his body, he thrust the broken broom handle forward. The sharp end of the wood struck the attacker square in the chest. The man's eyes widened in shock as the force drove him backward, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled, tripped, and fell hard onto the ground, the knife clattering from his hand. For the first time, the confidence in his expression cracked, replaced by panic. The taller man, still clutching his side, looked toward the gates. Sirens wailed louder now, police lights flashing in the distance. His fury twisted into fear. He grabbed his fallen partner by the arm and hissed something Catherine couldn't hear, but his intent was clear. Retreat. "Cowards!" one of the teachers shouted from near the doorway, but her voice trembled with relief. The two men scrambled toward the far side of the yard. One limped, the other staggered, but together they fled, vanishing just as the first police car screeched to a halt outside the school. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, shouting commands that filled the air like thunder. Catherine crawled forward, her hands shaking violently as she reached for Jack. He had dropped to one knee, his face pale, his shirt soaked crimson around his shoulder. Yet even in pain, his eyes sought hers, steady, grounding her in the storm. "You're safe," he rasped, his voice low but unbreakable. Her throat tightened, tears spilling as she shook her head. "You're bleeding. I've had worse," he muttered, though they both knew he hadn't. He swayed, his grip on the broom loosening at last. Lily bolted across the pavement before anyone could stop her, throwing her arms around her mother, sobbing into Catherine's chest. Catherine clutched her tightly, her free hand reaching out toward Jack, as if afraid he might vanish. Around them, the schoolyard was chaos. Sirens, radios crackling, children crying as teachers herded them inside. But to Catherine, the world had narrowed to a single, shocking truth. She was alive because of him. The janitor, the man who blended into the background, the one no one saw. He had bled for her, fought for her, without hesitation. And though she didn't know it yet, at that moment, blood on the ground, a broken broom in his hands, would stay with her for the rest of her life. The headlines arrived before Catherine even had time to process what had happened. By the next morning, every local newspaper and news channel carried the same story. Millionaire CEO saved by school janitor. The photo they used was grainy, snapped hastily by a parent with a cell phone. Catherine, her white suit smeared with dirt, clutching Lily in her arms, while a dark-haired man in a blood-stained shirt sat slumped on the curb. An officer crouched beside him. The image was everywhere, and within hours, Jack Martin, a man who had lived most of his adult life in the shadows, became an unwilling symbol of quiet heroism. But Jack didn't feel like a hero. He sat in the hospital that night with his arms strapped tightly in bandages, the antiseptic sting still sharp in his nostrils. His shoulder throbbed, each pulse a reminder of the blade that had carved through muscle. He should have been proud, triumphant, maybe even basking in the praise. Instead, all he could think about was Noah, his son, who had waited at home, alone, long after dinner had grown cold. Jack had told a neighbor to check in, but the guilt gnawed at him anyway. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Noah's face the way it had been the night his mother died. Pale, frightened, lost. Jack had promised himself that night he would never let his son feel unprotected again. Yet here he was, lying in a hospital bed, broken and bleeding. When the door creaked open, he expected a nurse. Instead, Catherine stepped inside. Her hair was tied back now, her suit replaced by jeans and a plain sweater, but her presence filled the room just as it had in the schoolyard. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she belonged there. Then she crossed the space between them and sat down in the chair by his bed. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to really look at him. His face was pale, lines of exhaustion etched deep into his skin, but his eyes, the same eyes that had locked onto her attackers with unflinching resolve, met hers steadily. She opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment nothing came out. Gratitude seemed too small a word, too fragile to hold the weight of what he had done. "You saved me," she whispered finally, her voice cracking. Jack gave a faint, humorless smile. "You'd have done the same for anyone." "No," she said quickly, shaking her head, her eyes glistening. "No one else did. Not the teachers, not the parents, not even me. I froze. But you," her voice faltered, "you bled for me, for my daughter. You didn't even know us." Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't want her gratitude. It felt too heavy, too much like a spotlight he had never asked for. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "I couldn't just stand there. Not with your little girl watching." For a moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the steady beeping of the monitor beside his bed. Catherine reached out, her hand hovering in hesitation before finally resting lightly on his. Her touch was gentle, careful, as if afraid he might shatter. He didn't pull away. The police had taken her statement earlier that day, and she had told them everything about the files her company had uncovered, the names she had turned over to investigators, the threats that had begun weeks before. She knew the attack was no coincidence, and she knew it was far from over. But as she sat there beside Jack, watching the man who had stepped forward when no one else dared, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. The nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting the bandages, but Catherine stayed. Hours slipped by unnoticed. She called her assistant to arrange for Lily to stay the night with a trusted family friend, but she refused to leave Jack alone. He tried to protest once, telling her she didn't owe him anything, but she silenced him with a look. Sharp, determined, the same look she wore in boardrooms when people underestimated her. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, Jack had drifted into a restless sleep. Catherine sat beside him still, her head bowed, her fingers lightly entwined with his. She realized then how strange life could be. A single day could tear down everything you thought you knew, strip away illusions of control and safety, and yet also reveal strength where you least expected it. Jack Martin had been invisible, a man most people look past without a second thought. But to her, he was no longer invisible. He was the reason she was alive, the reason her daughter still had a mother. And though she could not yet put it into words, she knew that something had shifted between them forever. The months that followed were a blur of courtroom hearings, police interviews, and headlines that refused to die. Catherine's name filled the news cycle for weeks, tied to corruption charges that toppled powerful men and exposed a network of crime stretching further than anyone had imagined. She testified in courtrooms under heavy security, her voice steady even as threats shadowed her every step. When the verdicts came, long sentences, guilty pleas, and public disgrace, it was hailed as a victory for justice. But for Catherine, the true victory was quieter. She had survived. Lily had survived. And they had not faced it alone. Jack recovered slowly. The wound in his shoulder left a jagged scar, a reminder he would carry for the rest of his life. The hospital visits faded into physical therapy sessions, then into quiet evenings where his son Noah teased him about moving like an old man. At first, Jack resisted the attention the world wanted to give him. The school called him a hero. The mayor invited him to stand at a podium and shake hands for the cameras. He declined as often as he could, uncomfortable in the spotlight. He wanted only to return to his routine, to his quiet life with his son, to the broom in the schoolyard where no one looked twice at him. But life had a way of refusing invisibility once it had been broken. Catherine made sure of that. She began appearing at the school more often, no longer hidden behind tinted windows or sending drivers in her place. She arrived with Lily, sometimes in jeans and sneakers instead of tailored suits, carrying coffee in her hands instead of a briefcase. At first, people whispered, "What was a woman like her doing, sitting on the front steps with the janitor during morning drop-off, laughing softly at something only he could have said?" But the whispers faded as the weeks turned into a new routine. Jack, for his part, found himself smiling more than he had in years. Catherine had a way of piercing through his stubborn silence, of asking questions he didn't expect and refusing to let him hide behind short answers. She learned about Noah, about the nights Jack worked extra shifts to pay rent, about the photographs of his late wife tucked away in a drawer he rarely opened. And Jack, in turn, learned about Catherine's world, the boardrooms and lawsuits, the loneliness of power, the way she had clawed her way into a place no one believed she belonged. She admitted to him, one evening as they watched their kids chase each other across the playground, that sometimes the white suit was just armor, a way to hide how exhausted she really was. Their children bonded quickly. Lily adored Noah, trailing after him with wide-eyed admiration, while Noah, awkward and lanky, still growing into himself, secretly liked the responsibility of watching out for her. Catherine would catch Jack watching them sometimes, pride softening the hard lines of his face, and she understood then that beneath his strength was a tenderness he rarely showed the world. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. Jack still carried the weight of loss, and Catherine still bore the scars of betrayal. But together they discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of violence, a kind of fragile peace, built not on wealth or reputation, but on trust, shared glances, and the knowledge of what they had endured side by side. One crisp autumn evening, long after the trial had ended, Catherine walked out of the school with Jack by her side. The sun dipped low, casting the playground in golden light. Lily's laughter echoed as she swung high on the swings, Noah pretending not to laugh but smiling anyway. Catherine glanced at Jack, her hand brushing his as they walked. He didn't pull away. "You know," she said quietly, almost teasing, "you never did let me thank you properly." Jack gave a small, crooked smile, eyes fixed on the children. "You've already thanked me more than enough." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't. You changed everything that day." For a long moment he didn't answer. Then finally he turned to her, his gaze steady, unguarded. "Maybe you changed everything too." They stood there in silence, the sound of children's laughter filling the air around them. The world that had once seemed fractured, broken by violence and fear, now felt whole again, stitched together not by perfection, but by resilience, by love that had grown from the most unlikely of places. That morning months ago had begun with screams, blood, and the sharp sting of terror. But its ending was here, in this quiet schoolyard, where a single father with a scar on his shoulder and a woman who had worn her armor too long finally found something neither of them expected: a second chance. And in that golden light, with their children safe and their paths intertwined, it was clear that the story they were writing together was only just beginning. This story, to me, is not only about an attack and a rescue. At its core, it is a reminder that the most invisible people in our world often hold the greatest strength. Jack represents quiet courage, the kind that doesn't seek recognition or reward. He never set out to be a hero, but when the moment came, he stepped forward without hesitation, proving that true bravery often comes from the most unexpected places. Catherine, in contrast, embodies power, wealth, and control. Yet in the schoolyard, she discovers the one truth she had overlooked. No amount of influence or money could have protected her in that instant. What saved her was not her position, but a man with nothing more than a mop and an unshakable will. Her survival is not just physical, it is emotional. For the first time, she allows herself to be vulnerable, to realize that she doesn't always need to fight alone. The ending for me is not simply about a millionaire and a janitor finding one another. It's about rediscovering what really matters: loyalty, courage, and the ability to protect and love beyond measure. It's about second chances, Jack learning that happiness is still possible after loss, and Catherine discovering that life outside boardrooms can be filled with something far richer than success. And perhaps the greatest message of all: the true heroes in life are often the ones we never notice until the world falls apart, and they're the only ones left standing.